Risk of Rain 1 and Risk of Rain 2 are the exact same video game from different perspectives. Both of them are roguelike shooters where you spawn into a randomly selected map and use your character's power sets such as firearms, fireballs, and just plain fire to fight hordes of enemies to earn experience and cold hard cash. These are used to level up, increasing your health and DPS, and to purchase loot, which can increase your speed, power, abilities, and everything else to a near infinite exponent. You're then tasked with locating a teleporter placed in a different spot of the level every playthrough, and defeating the boss that guards it. Once you're all set, you're spirited away to another map with its own new aesthetic to repeat the process. You will lose all the money earned in the previous level converted to experience as a consolation, however you'll maintain your level and loot. The longer your run lasts, the more durable and deadly you'll become, reaching positively ludicrous tiers of power. Of course, your opposition gains buffs of their own, such as more firepower, health, and elemental effects. Eventually, your run will come to an end, either by succumbing to overwhelming opposition or of your own volition. Everything I've just described perfectly encapsulates the gameplay of both Risk of Rain and Risk of Rain 2. The only major difference in the gameplay, not to speak of the amount of content as Risk of Rain 2 is currently in early access, is the first game is a 2D side-scroller, almost Metroidvania in its presentation, and the second game is a 3D third-person shooter with maps designed to accommodate this. And yet, while being incredibly similar aside, both games are excellent and unique experiences in their own right. While I prefer the sequel to the original, it in no way invalidates the existence of both games. Often a sequel to a game, assuming it's not terrible, will either be a flat-out continuation of a narrative, or in the case of games which lack much of a narrative to speak of, like Risk of Rain, simply improved versions of their predecessors. In this case, it can often lead to the original title being entirely overshadowed, as after all, why play a less featureful version of effectively the same game? Yet somehow, Risk of Rain 1 continues to stand as an excellent game, if anything, thriving in the shadow of its successor. And while this may sound like a knock against Risk of Rain 2, it by no means is. It seems all it took was moving the camera to make a perfect sequel to Risk of Rain. The point of this video is not to ceaselessly praise Hopoo Games' work on these titles, although much credit is due for their brilliant and original structure, but rather to admire how such a simple concept for a sequel can create a new experience while changing very little. Of course, that's not to say the development time and effort put in just came down to take the camera and put it somewhere else. A change of engines, acquiring a publisher, and an entirely new philosophy of level design had to be adopted to accommodate something as seemingly simple as, what if the game was in 3D? And it seems that concept wasn't a decision made for much other reason than it would look cool. In a PC Gamer interview linked below with the lead devs Duncan and Paul, they mentioned that Risk of Rain 2 was originally conceptualized as another 2D side-scroller, likely still being made in GameMaker, with graphics still drawn literally in MS Paint. However, the devs really wanted to take some leaps and bounds with the game's art direction, most notably citing the idea of every piece of equipment you pick up being visible on your character's model, such as sunglasses, pet birds, goat hooves, missile launchers, all the things you'd find in an average wardrobe. However, the tiny stylized pixel art of Risk of Rain 1 simply didn't provide the canvas necessary to make this idea a reality. As a result, they took a half step into the next dimension for a 2.5D look, i.e. the game renders in 3 dimensions but plays in 2. While this gave them the artistic wiggle room to take aesthetic liberties, it also opened the door to the idea of, why don't we just make it 3D? So while the prototype for 2.5 Risk of Rain may have taken some time to develop, it also helped the very small dev team of Hopoo, I really hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, it'll be embarrassing otherwise, to learn the ins and outs of making a game with more dimensions, if only half a one. So in less than a month's time, they ballooned from 2.5 to a full 3 dimensions of space to play in. With this change came some new problems to overcome, however. For instance, enemies in Risk of Rain 1 could easily overwhelm you with their numbers and slap you to death with melee-based attacks. But as any Killing Floor player can attest, having a 3rd dimension to escape to allows enemies to be kited with ease. Kiting, for the record, means perpetually running away from them in circles to passively regenerate your health before striking again. While possible in limited situations in the first game, Risk of Rain 2's more open areas, inherent in adding a new axis altogether, posed a challenge in terms of enemy design. As a result, while the character design for enemies remained very much the same, the jump from 2D to 3D required a new take on their attacks. The primarily melee-focused attacks of Risk of Rain 1 have now been relegated to a second secondary form of attack, whereas ranged combat has now become the main focus of gameplay. While this adds a layer of skill not present in the first game, i.e. aiming, this is by no means a bad thing. And if it's a deal breaker for you, understandably enough, playable characters such as the Huntress have auto-aiming weapons to streamline combat. And this is not to say that melee has disappeared altogether by any means with unlockable characters such as the Mercenary. That's a point worth mentioning in its own right. While a roguelike at heart, Risk of Rain, both 1 and 2, embody roguelite elements of unlocking items which persist into future playthroughs. For instance, characters with different ability sets can be unlocked by completing achievements, and new loot drops can be made to enter the system of possible item spawns by carrying out certain tasks. And also, artifacts, which are unlockable modifiers that can completely change the balance of the game, and they're not available yet in Risk of Rain 2. But they'll be back, so no flack for lack of artifacts. I could also go on about how excellent the final boss of Risk of Rain is, especially considering you can choose to delay the inevitable fight as long as you please to suit yourself up further. Risk of Rain 2, while it has a secret bonus boss, lacks a proper ending altogether, but again, this is likely due to the endgame simply not being a priority to develop, with the core gameplay loop of combat, loot, upgrade, teleport taking precedent. And besides, Risk of Rain may be an excellent game, but the sequel did make some, what I would consider, objective improvements to the format. For instance, after beating a boss guarding a teleporter in Risk of Rain 1, before leaving, you're tasked with killing all the remaining enemies in the entire map, no matter how far away they are. This has been done away with altogether in Risk of Rain 2. And the addition of Lunar Coins, a currency that persists outside of the boundaries of a single run, which can be used to buy characters, and lunar items which grant incredible powers with intense drawbacks. I could go on about the gameplay mechanics of both games, but that'd be better saved for an eventual review of Risk of Rain 2 when it finally exits early access. The point of this video, as I've mentioned, is to praise the ingenuity of the change of format. It's not even just conceptually a good sequel, it's near flawlessly executed. Risk of Rain 2 controls solidly, it just feels good to play. Inputs are smooth, dealing damage feels punchy, and at least on my hardware, it runs rather well until you hit bananas tiers of enemies and DPS. The art style, while subject to change due to the early access nature, feels like a natural progression from a purposefully pixelated style to a voluntarily voxelized style. The colors especially are still bright, flat, and crisp in a very satisfying way. And the music, as was the case with the first game, is breathtaking. You've been hearing it this whole time, the kind of energetic but meaningful electronic music that perfectly encapsulates the whole experience. It's the kind of game that's perfect to just kill time with friends over, just to boot up, do a run, or 2 or 3 if you get in over your head, and see how crazy your powers can get, what kind of wild combinations you'll end up with. Overall, it just fascinates me, especially as someone who played Risk of Rain 2 before Risk of Rain 1, how natural, how nearly obvious the leap from 2D to 3D was. And yet both games hold up and stand on their own and will inherently appeal to players of one another. How one game slopes into another in either direction. If you normally don't care for third-person shooters, playing Risk of Rain 1 will more than likely make you inclined to give the sequel a go, which may well grant you an interest in a whole new genre you otherwise never would have partaken in. And the opposite is true. Looking at Risk of Rain 1 before having tried the sequel, I personally would have never expected it to grab me as much as it has. But I gave it a chance after playing Risk of Rain 2 since it's a genre I'm far more accustomed to. And as a result, I suddenly gained interest in roguelikes more than ever before. I guess that's my overarching point here. I've never seen a sequel to a game have the power to introduce new genres to players so smoothly, keeping everything that makes the gameplay work while simultaneously granting a new experience and a new genre. In my eyes, makes Risk of Rain 2 a perfect sequel. If given the chance and you haven't already, please try one or both of the Risk of Rains. Either one will do, although if you're looking to play multiplayer, you'll likely have more luck with the sequel. If you're willing to port forward for the first game or just sticking to single player, either game will do you just fine. Just pick the style you're more comfortable with, 2D or 3D. Then, if you're craving more, you can try the other game and already know pretty much exactly what you're doing. And maybe, if you're like me, you'll broaden your savviness of genre in general. Links to both games, as well as the interview from PC Gamer I've been referencing, are below. And while you're down there, maybe you could consider subscribing? Or checking out my streams over on Twitch, where I'll be playing plenty of Risk of Rain 2, I'm sure. Either way, that'll be it from me. Thanks for watching, and take it easy.